there is this necessity to recognize the humanity of the other in the times of greatest conflict. If we do not see the humanity in the other side, then we're on the side of the extremists.
There's good statistical evidence, right, that anti-Semitic instances have gone right up.
Yes, while in fact there is also good statistical evidence that most British Jews are not supporters of the Netanyahu government. There's no sense whatsoever to what happened on October 7th or to the response. It is senseless on both sides.
Hello and welcome to The Sacred. My name is Elizabeth Oldfield, and this is a podcast about the deep values of the people shaping our common life. Every episode I speak to someone with some kind of public voice from a very wide range of political, metaphysical, and professional perspectives. This week's guest is Richard Allen Greene, who has had a long and illustrious career in journalism, most recently as CNN's Jerusalem bureau chief. He's now training to be a rabbi, and I'm really looking forward to speaking to him. Richard, thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you for inviting me. This is a real honor.
Tell me what's sacred to you.
So I knew this was going to be your opening question, and I don't have a good answer to that.
It's okay.
Partly because sacred is not a word that appears particularly in Jewish liturgy and Jewish thought. We tend to use the word holy. And the word holy is all over our liturgy and our thought and our Torah. And so I went to my tutor, who is very much a words and books guy. And I said, Charles, am I crazy? What is my reaction here? And he said, I don't think you are. He said, go to the Oxford English Dictionary and see what you find. And sacred comes from the Latin and I think has inherently Christian overtones as a result. And I was surprised to see holy actually goes right back into Old English with Norse and German and Danish cognates. And I have no idea why the Jews should have chosen to fixate on an Old English word rather than a Latin word.
What's the word in Hebrew that's being translated as holy?
Kadosh.
And what are the associations?
So kadosh is, Hebrew is based on three-letter roots, so you can make all kinds of other words related concepts once you've got that root. And that root is to do with separation, which is a big part of how Judaism defines what is holy. The Sabbath, Shabbat, is separate from the other 6 days, and it is holy. And at the end of Shabbat, you have a ceremony called Havdalah, and you thank God for separating the holiness of the Sabbath from the 6 days of work,
right?
For example. So a lot of Jewish thought about holy is what is separate from daily. And so in Christianity, as I understand it, the difference between the sacred and the profane, in Judaism, the difference is between the holy and the everyday. And the everyday is not profane in the sense of being unholy. It's just, this is ordinary stuff.
Yeah.
6 days you work, the seventh day you rest in a way that is a recognition of the holiness of the seventh day of creation.
And is the sense that what is holy, what is separated, set apart, is the kind of, what the image that's coming to head is it's the anchor for everything else, that everything else is around it and you're coming in and out of it, but it is, then it's not a binary, it's the centering.
It is binary. Something is holy or it is every day.
Yeah.
A day is holy or every day. And there's this, the towering 20th century Jewish rabbi, thinker, activist, mystic, Abraham Joshua Heschel, famously talked about how Jews don't have cathedrals in space, we have cathedrals in time. And Shabbat is our cathedral in time. And it is, we go into Shabbat to worship and to thank and to express gratitude for creation.
Yes. Richard, thank you, because, I started this project asking people what's sacred to them and trying to make really explicit that I didn't necessarily mean anything religious by it, but we've been doing it since 2017. And what I meant by it is kind of what is your anchor? What are your deep values? What are you trying to orient yourself by? And I hadn't even realized how much those overtones, one, are, I think, more inherently religious than I like to admit, and also more Christian coded. So kind of knowing a bit about the project and what's underneath the question, whether you want to answer the question, what is holy to you, or just what are your kind of deep and abiding values you're trying to live by? What have you got for me?
Okay, so here I'm going to launch directly into something I think we're going to get to later, the Jewish this and also this.
Yes.
So all of my, we don't really talk about sacred. Yes, of course, like what I'm thinking about more and more since I got out of journalism and into the very beginnings of a rabbinate is recognizing and valuing the differences between people. And you and I have already talked a little bit about my sense that there is this necessity to recognize the humanity of the other in the times of greatest conflict. And that if we do not see the humanity in the other side, whoever the other side is, then we're on the side of the extremists. We're on the side of recognition and affirming and welcoming and honoring the humanity of other people, or we're not. That is a binary. And we're not going to agree with each other. I'm not saying this is not a, hold hands and sing Kumbaya moment. But the challenge is people with whom we have profound, sometimes violent disagreements are still people. And that's something I've been thinking about a lot lately. So that to me is sacred.
Tell me a bit about your childhood, particularly any big ideas that were in the air that were formative.
So I grew up in the United States, in the suburbs of Chicago in the 1970s and 80s. I was a member of a Reform Jewish synagogue on the spectrum of Jewish practice. That's among the more progressive. And my Judaism growing up in this congregation particularly, and I think in Reform Judaism in those days, was very much about the Jewish concept of Tikkun Olam, which means healing the world. It permeates all of Judaism. It is not something that Reform own or invented or isolated. It is throughout. But Reform Judaism, when I was growing up, was really focused on it. So we were Jews in order to make the world a better place. For us, practically, that meant marching for Soviet Jews who were being denied permission to emigrate, the refuseniks, like Natan Sharansky and thousands of others who were imprisoned either in actual prisons or simply from not being able to leave the Soviet Union. Fair housing was a huge cause for my particular congregation in those days. And so it was very much about social justice.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about your mum and dad, if you're willing.
They are wonderful. Thanks, Mom and Dad. You did great. I'm so proud of you. I love you. We'll cut that out later.
This is like giddy. Now that you're not at CNN, you can say all kinds of smushy stuff.
Yeah, I would have said that to them before. My parents were raised. They were both raised in Jewish homes in an earlier generation where Reform Judaism was very much about assimilation. Prayers in English. You're the leader of your congregation would probably want to have been called Dr. Oldfield instead of Rabbi Oldfield, theoretically speaking. It was, very much assimilationist, integrationist. Prayer books would have run in the order of an English book rather than right to left like a Hebrew book. It would have been largely in English. And the generations since them, progressive Judaism, Reform and Liberal Judaism, has brought back in more and more, wear a kippah, wear a talit, prayer shah, speak a lot of Hebrew, do your prayer book, the other direction.
I'm fascinated by how this connects to kind of like immigrant identities and thick cultures more directly, and also how religious institutions change. Do you think there is an argument that assimilationist trajectory can just dilute things sufficiently that it dissolves away?
What I know about is the American Jewish immigrant experience. So my parents were both born in the States. My grandparents were all born in the States, but they were of a generation, when my grandparents were children, was when the United States, between the wars, was enacting curbs on immigration aimed at Jews, restrictions on percentage of Jews you would have in university.
Wow.
So looking back on it, the assimilationist response from Jews is not at all surprising.
Yeah.
And then presumably, Jews have grown in confidence. People, wildly overestimate the number of Jews there are in the world and in the UK and in the US. And I think, with that confidence comes a sense of like, okay, we are who we are. I felt some of it in my own life growing up. I wasn't raised keeping kosher, for example. My mother still loves her bacon. Won't eat bread during Passover, but still eats her bacon. I know. It confuses the waiters and waitresses in the restaurants. But there was definitely a time in my early teenage years where I thought, okay, I'm Jewish and I'm here to repair the world, Tikkun Olam, but I don't speak Hebrew. I don't live in Israel. I don't keep kosher. I don't pray with a talit prayer shawl on. I don't pray in Hebrew. And so what does my Jewish identity really mean? And so I myself started I don't know how conscious this was as a 13, 14, 15-year-old, but certainly by the time I was in my late teens, I knew that I was doing it because I felt like being Jewish was not, it's not a faith alone kind of religion. It is a works religion. It's what you do. Yeah. And Judaism has been caricatured for centuries as not having theology, as not having faith. Those things are not true. Yeah. We have theology, we have faith, but it is very much like, this is what you do. Yeah. This is when you light the candles. This is what time you say the Shema in the morning. This is what time you say the Shema in the evening. And there was a part of me which is like, if I'm not doing any of those things, what does it mean? Yeah. So I started keeping kosher. I started wearing kippah on Shabbat and holidays because it felt to me like there had to be some practice associated with my sense that I was a Jew.
Yeah. It's funny what we rebel against, isn't it? I want to ask a question and I'm trying to formulate it in a way that is not heavily Christian coded. It's really hard because of my voice.
Say it how you feel it and I'll answer it how I feel it.
So the super Protestant framing in my head is, tell me about your relationship with God. But I know even using that word in some, that can border on offensive in some places so whatever. Okay.
I'm good with it.
So I've had a bunch of Jewish guests over the years. They've all answered slightly differently. But for you, how much is this divine presence, kind of external other, the Holy of Holies? Just tell me about that element.
My answer to that would probably be different every day.
Me too.
I do not have a fixed idea of what God is. Yeah. And as a beginning rabbinic student reading about like the philosopher's God and the mystic's God, and I'm reading a lot of Karen Armstrong, which I love. I've had times of believing in the immanent philosopher's God of the world is so extraordinary and so beautiful that how can there not be a God? And I've had moments of, Stephen Hawking-ish, like if you just understood how big and old it all was, you would grasp that it really can be random. Yeah. But we can't, but trust us on this, it could be. I recently had to deliver a Devar Torah, a sermon, literally a word of Torah. And I'll stick with Devar because sermon, I think, again, is a slightly Christian concept and preachier than I am comfortable with myself at this point in my very early rabbinate. It was one of these terrible Torah portions where it's really like, here's how you build the ark, here's what the priest has to wear, here's the order of gemstones on the breastplate. Yeah. And you look at this
it's like a DIY manual.
It's exactly what it is. Like my rabbi and many others call it the IKEA chapters of the Torah. And you're like, what meaning am I going to draw from this for a congregation?
Yeah.
How can I say something meaningful about this? And tucked in the middle of it is this one sentence: "They will build me an ark that I may dwell among them." And this is the only meaningful verse in the entire thing. And so it's what everybody riffs on. And the concept that there's a reason for building the ark. There's a reason for all of this DIY instruction, which is so that God can dwell among the children of Israel. And God's not saying, I will dwell in the ark, saying, I will dwell among the children of Israel. And the word that God uses for dwell is, it's the Hebrew word shachan, which has been adapted into the word Shekhinah, one of the names of God, grammatically feminine in Hebrew. And so a lot of people who want to push the idea that God is not an old man with a white beard sitting on a cloud with a big tome and a quill pen are using the word Shekhinah because it is a feminine word, and to say, hold on, don't think about God that way.
Yeah.
And because the Shekhinah is thought of as dwelling within people. And I had recently heard another wonderful podcast, other than yours, where I heard of one of the freed Israeli hostages from October the 7th talking about her sympathy for the people of Gaza. And she said, people say to me, how can you feel sorry for them after what you've been through? And she said, I am not going to let Hamas take me away from me. I'm a person who feels, and I want good for good people, and most people are good. And in my Dvar Torah, I said, this is what it looks like for the Shekhinah to dwell within a person. This is someone who has some holiness in her.
Gosh.
It was controversial.
Let's come back to that.
Okay.
There's a lot we could unpack. But first, I want to just get a sense of your journey.
Yes.
Journalism. Was it obvious that was going to be your path?
It was obvious to my mom.
Was it because you talked a lot?
Thank you, Elizabeth.
I say that with love.
I feel the love.
Yeah.
It was because writing has always come very easily to me.
Yeah.
I did back into it kind of accidentally. My degree is in theater, and I went into teaching English as a foreign language after I graduated in the state school system and was not earning enough to get by. And so I started freelance theater reviewing to make a little extra money and to get paid to go to the theater, which was wonderful. And then I was in the office one day writing a review when the editor fired the culture and arts editor for falsifying his resume and references.
Wow.
And he turned to me and he said, you are our new arts editor. And one thing led to another, and it turned into a 30-year career in journalism, which was wonderful.
A big chunk of which was in Prague. I'd love to just hear what that was like.
So that's where all this happened. I went, my first job in journalism was at the Prague Post.
Of course. That's an obvious place for a boy from Chicago to end up.
Obviously. I had no way of knowing this at the time, and there was no plan to my career, but it was the equivalent of going to work on a local paper and learning the craft.
Yeah.
And this was the early 90s, and so the editor and the editor-in-chief were, they seemed to me grizzled old guys who, the editor-in-chief would say, it's like bricklaying. You stack one sentence and one fact on another one until you've got a wall, and that's your article, and file it.
That sounds ever so digestible.
Yeah, it was great. It was great. I'm definitely now older than at least one of those grizzled old guys was at the time. So yeah, I ended up staying in Prague for 8 years. I became a journalist there. Met my wife there. She is a linguist by training. She was there because she spoke Czech and she wanted to brush up on her Czech. She's really talented. It's quite frustrating sometimes to be compared to her. She's British, and there came a point where she'd had enough of Prague and was ready to move home. And she looked at me and went, "I'm going to move to London." And I was like, "And I'm going to move to London? And she said, yes. Good.
Correct answer.
Good. So we moved here. We spent a year in graduate school at the LSE.
Mm-hmm.
As I graduated, the BBC was expanding there. It was the early days of online journalism. And I was a, American with a degree from the LSE who spoke Czech and knew how to use computers and got into the BBC, was there for 7 years on the World Desk of BBC News Online in the early days, which was fantastic.
Yeah.
They sent me to Washington, 2006, 2007, where
What's going on then?
There was a lot going on then, yes. We spent, in the BBC Washington Bureau, we spent a good chunk of 2006, 2007 debating whether that handsome young senator from Illinois was actually going to declare that he was running for president.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, a couple of weeks before the end of my rotation there, Barack Obama did declare that he was running for president. And the BBC said to me, okay, time to come back to London. And I said,
Yeah, this just got interesting.
So I quit. I went to work for Politico. In their early days, I was there for about a year. And then the beginning of 2008, when CNN was expanding to cover the 2008 presidential election, they hired me. I did the election. We came back to London right after that, and I had a fantastic CNN career.
And this feels like a ridiculous question, but the short form is, what is journalism? The slightly longer form is, you spent your life on, I don't know if you call it a vocation or career, but trying to do a thing in the world. At its best, what is the role that journalism plays in our common life?
So it never would have occurred to me to say this at the beginning of my career. And I did fall into it, really. I fell into it by accident. I feel guilty for all the people who have worked so hard to get into journalism and when it came so easily to me. Looking back on it, today, the role of journalism at its best is to give a society an agreed set of facts that they can then debate. And one of the leaders of CNN in the time that I was there said, you can't have a debate about whether it's raining. It's raining or it's not raining. And the job of the journalists is to say, it is raining. Yeah. And then you can debate, is rain good or bad? Oh, it's spoiled my picnic. No, we're in a drought. You can say, I like rain or I don't like rain. Yeah. But you cannot say it's not raining.
Yeah.
It goes without saying, but I will say it anyway. That's very much under threat today. And in the early days in Prague, it was interesting because Czech journalism, like I think a lot of European journalism, the newspapers are partisan.
Yeah.
And so you're reading you're reading the communist newspaper, or you're reading the, Thatcherite newspaper, or whatever it is in Prague. Prague the Czech Republic had a self-declared Thatcherite prime minister in its early days. And as Americans, young in our 20s, who all came from but wait, the San Francisco Chronicle, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, they're not Republican papers or Democratic papers. And so we had all these debates about which one is better? Should we be trying to be neutral when we are all coming from our own perspectives? Or is it more honest to say, we're communists and here's your news written by communists. We're Thatcherites. Here's your news written by Thatcherites.
Yeah.
Surprisingly, as a bunch of 20-year-old journalists in Prague, we did not resolve that question.
Where are you on it now? Because I worked at the BBC for 5 years.
Yes.
I really respect the attempt to be balanced, which is the way, certainly the language they were using when I was there, which is slightly different from neutral. And at its worst, felt like self-deceit. And I see that in academia as well.
Yeah.
And I think I have come to a kind of epistemology of that objectivity and neutrality are not possible for a human being.
Right.
And the best we can get to is deliberate diversity of opinion and then as much transparency and rigor and self-reflection as we possibly can. But I am getting close to the point of like, I trust people who think they are objective less than I trust people who are honestly non-objective, but open to other views. You know, you said to me as we came in, you know, I've been self-censoring for 30 years. The traditional model of journalism is you try and be objective, right? You take yourself out of the picture.
Yes.
You do not have a kind of grounded. You're trying to have a view from nowhere, not a view from some person.
Right. So I'm going to leap way ahead to the end of my journalism career and CNN. I think we might have overlapped at the BBC, actually. And I know exactly what you're talking about in this BBC sense that if we're getting criticized by both sides, we're doing it right. I finished my journalism career as CNN's Jerusalem bureau chief, which is a hot seat, even before October 7th. And a big part of my job in that role, you know, CNN, like many traditional journalism places, has an editorial process where many different sets of eyes look at the story before it goes out. And one of the things that it's meant to do at the BBC and CNN and other traditional media is to say, okay, well, Elizabeth has one point of view, Richard has another point of view, and there will be some edit that will smooth it out and make it more objective. Mm-hmm. At its best, the CNN Jerusalem Bureau, which had Palestinian journalists and native Israeli journalists and immigrant Israeli journalists, and a bureau chief trying to do his best, you know, there was real give and take and, you know, and respect between each other, fighting tooth and nail over every word because we were in the Middle East and every word you would fight tooth and nail over it. But there was a lot of respect between the journalists and a lot of trust of each other. It frayed over time, the more difficult things got, but that was a real effort to be objective about a story that mattered to a lot of people. So I think...
So can I just check what I'm hearing there?
Yes.
That sounds like a model of objectivity, which is not personal objectivity. As institutionally, we are going to fight it out between us and make sure we've heard a different range of perspectives. And then we're going to agree on something that probably is going to piss off some of us, but over time is enough of a sense of this is what we're going to say as an institution because we've done the hard work, honestly, as a community.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
With objectivity being the goal. Because you, Elizabeth Oldfield, could be the greatest Middle East expert and the greatest journalist and the greatest writer in the world, but you are also a person with views. Yeah. And so, you know, I would have several other people look at your work before it goes out. And ultimately, I had the final say.
So tell me more about that job. When you went there after October 7th?
No, I didn't. I went there in February 2023.
Right.
So for people who remember the weekly Saturday night demonstrations in Israel against the Netanyahu government's effort to overhaul the judicial system.
Yeah.
I arrived on the Monday morning after the first Saturday night demonstration. So it was already...
Pretty intense.
It was already pretty intense. I was there short term. There was no bureau chief for the election when Netanyahu and his far-right nationalist government came to power. And then I went back to London for a couple of months. And then I came in as bureau chief a couple of months later when things were heating up.
And presumably you wanted the job. If you did, why did you want it?
So at that point, I already knew that I was applying to rabbinic school and when.
Wow.
And so it's funny. I had a friend of mine, an ex-CNN friend of mine, when I announced that I was leaving journalism and going to rabbi school, he said, "We send you to Jerusalem for 1 year and you think you can be a rabbi." But in fact, it was very much the opposite. I had decided that I was applying to rabbinic school. I knew when the Jerusalem job was opening up. Mm-hmm. I knew that my Hebrew was not very good.
Right.
And I thought, wouldn't this be a great way to learn Hebrew and an exciting capstone to my career?
Wow.
And on one of those things, I was completely wrong. And on the other thing, I was much, much too right.
Yes.
It was very
most people
exciting.
would have just gone to night class, Richard, rather than attempt to hold together. I genuinely, we had a little bit of contact while you were there, but you've kind of said the beautiful side of trying to hold together a team that are navigating deeply traumatic news in which many of them are personally connected, right? Every day.
All of them.
Right. What I'm sort of imagining a bureau chief as this sort of strange, like boss / chaplain / parent / therapist. Like what does a bureau chief do? I guess maybe in general, and in that particular context, what did you end up doing?
In general, in normal times, not in Jerusalem, it's the senior management. It's managing day-to-day assignments.
Mm-hmm.
Jerusalem is more intense, and I used to say to people at CNN, in trying to train people to cover the story, because I did a fair amount of teaching to try to reduce my own workload. I tried to teach people what I was looking for when I was editing their work. The Jerusalem story, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is not more complicated than any other story in the world, but more people care more about it than almost any other story, right? Half the people in the world are Christian, Muslim, or Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
I throw the Jews in there. It's really half the people in the world are Christian or Muslim. And so that's why the word choice is so important. And at a minimum, all the facts absolutely have to be right, but the words the nuances have to be right as well. And so that was a big part of my role. I did, particularly post-October 7th, end up doing as much chaplaincy as I could, as much being the bureau rabbi as I could, because everybody who worked in the bureau, and it's a small bureau, there's like 8 of us. One had 2 sons in the army, so in tanks in Gaza. One had a husband who was a pilot who had been protesting and saying he would not fly if the judicial reform went through, and that all evaporated instantly when the war started, and he was recalled from, civilian life and was in the air. One of the Jerusalemites was watching hour after hour of traumatic video being sent to her from Gaza and said to me, "These people all look and sound like me and my family." And one was in Gaza with his pregnant wife and 2 children trying to get out. So it's a small country, and everybody was personally affected. And trying to hold that did break me. I ended up on mental health leave for a couple of weeks, which I'm glad I did, and which I was very public about, because it was, I think people assumed that it was the story, but I was one step removed. I was management.
Yeah.
I was not looking at the horrible videos my producers were looking at.
Yeah.
But I was trying to hold them and their grief and their pain.
Yeah.
And, not to over dramatize it, but how personal was it? There was when the news broke that one of the hostages who was thought to be held alive in Gaza had been killed on October 7th, and his body was being held in Gaza. He was a 19-year-old Israeli-American. His name was Itai Chen, and Israel announced that they had proof that he had been killed on the day. And my job was immediately to tell CNN this, because CNN wasn't going to report it until the bureau chief approved it. I needed to make sure that CNN knew the facts, that they were clear to report it, that they were going to pronounce his name correctly, and that we had a photograph of him, and that our correspondent knew what he could say on air. While sitting next to me was the producer who had got this news, whose son is the same age in Gaza and is named Itai. He had the same name as the kid who was killed. And I've got to get all the news out, but I've also got to think about the producer sitting next to me. And I got it all out, and he'd gone very quiet. And I turned to him and I said, "Are you okay?" And he said, "At least now the parents know." It was hard times. Hard times.
I listened to one interview that you did about this time, And you said, I wasn't there as a Jew, I was there as a journalist.
True.
Maybe there or after or now, what are you drawing on to make sense of that scale of suffering? And yeah, that feels like the biggest, oldest question is very unfair. But I guess, how are you making meaning from your tradition, from your life, as a journalist, as a Jew, as a rabbi in training?
There's no sense whatsoever to what happened on October 7th or to the response. It is senseless on both sides. There's no meaning in it. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
So we'll pull it back to the Torah.
Good idea.
Two sons of Aaron the high priest, Moses' brother, bring a strange fire before Adonai, before the Lord, and they're consumed. And the response, we don't have anything as short as Jesus wept, but one of the shortest verses in the Torah is, and Aaron was silent. Their fathers seen these two sons struck down by strange fire, and it's not clear why, what they did wrong, but they are consumed by strange fire and they die, and Aaron is silent. And Moses speaks, and it's not clear if he's trying to console or explain, but he says something totally inappropriate, totally wrong. And there's a wonderful essay that I read when I was writing about this portion is by a rabbi. I think her son was killed in a car crash in Israel or something. Some things just are senseless. They just are. And it's wrong to try to force meaning into them. It's wrong to say, from this tragedy, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
Hamas and the Netanyahu government both have their own interests and their own reasons for what they did. But this is a meaningless, senseless war from which I don't draw any lessons in a moral, meaningful way.
Yeah. Let's turn to your time now training to be a rabbi. I gather that since October 7th, there's been a real spike in attendance at synagogues. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. There is. So again, two things are true. It's a difficult time to be a Jew.
Yeah.
It's a difficult time to be a public Jew. I can tell you about the demonstration that I walked past in Manchester last week, if you like. But Jews, I think, definitely in the UK where I live, in England, feel targeted, blamed, associated with the appalling way that the Netanyahu government is carrying out its war in Gaza.
And there's good statistical evidence, right, that anti-Semitic instances have gone right up.
Yes. While, in fact, there is also good statistical evidence that most British Jews are not supporters of the Netanyahu government, right? There's this very irritating irony of we're not Israelis, we're not there, we don't even particularly like that guy. British Jews, by and large, opposed the attempt to disempower the judiciary, to expand West Bank settlements, and are being visibly targeted by people who think, Jew equals Israeli equals Netanyahu supporter.
Yeah.
So some of what we see in terms of synagogue attendance is we need the support of being among our own people.
Yeah.
I'm not a huge fan of the phrase safe space, and not all synagogues are safe spaces because Jews, like everybody else, are deeply divided about how this war is being prosecuted. How can we hold our grief and anger about what happened on the 7th of October? And
ongoing trauma.
And yes. And not just for Israelis, but worldwide for Jews, it's very personal. Everybody knows somebody, except in the ultra-Orthodox world, which is insular and was not particularly personally affected by it. I had a cousin in Texas, one of my mother's cousins, email me and say, Hirsch Goldberg Poland's cousin is a friend of mine. Do you want to talk to her? Hirsch was one of the, I hate this phrase. He was one of the, I was going to say iconic. I hate that word. He was one of the most recognizable hostages. He was this beautiful 23-year-old, smiling, bearded, curly-haired kid whose hand was blown off by a grenade when he was taken on October 7th, and people assumed he hadn't survived. He did survive, only to be killed when the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces were trying to rescue him and several hostages. He was killed by his captors at that point. And when he did, it hit me personally. Different faces meant different things to me, and he just happened to be one of those faces that resonated with me. Many of them did. But I posted about it, and a high school friend of mine went, oh yeah, I went to high school with his parents.
Yeah.
It's so personal for so many people. So wanting to be among people who you don't have to explain that to, I think is probably driving some of the return to synagogue attendance and other Jewish activities.
You won a Ed Moreau Award for a study in anti-Semitism.
I did.
When was that? When was
CNN
that?
did.
Yeah, you did. When was that?
It was for a project that we did in 2018.
Yeah.
Among many other things that I dabbled with data journalism for a couple of years, particularly survey design because of my experience doing political journalism and reading surveys and polling data. And in 2018, one of my colleagues was talking to friends, Clarissa Ward, extraordinary journalist and person and human being. And she had Jewish friends telling her in London that they were concerned.
Yeah.
And she's not Jewish. And she thought, where is that coming from? And is that really a thing? And so that spun into a 7-country survey. We surveyed 7,000 people, 1,000 in each of 7 countries. And we put a lot of different statements to them to try to tease out whether there were prevalent anti-Semitic attitudes and to what extent. And I had spent years quietly telling my father, who was very concerned about anti-Semitism in the world, I was like, Dad, you're reading the reports of people whose job is to look for anti-Semitism, and you're going to find anti-Semitism if that's where you're getting your information from. Their job is to find it and fight it, so they will find it and fight it.
Yeah.
And then CNN did it, and we found it. And it was surprising that, the numbers were not huge, but like 1 in 20 people saying they had never heard of the Holocaust, like that's 5% of people. It's not a lot of people, but that anybody has not heard of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And then when you get into some of the traditional anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jews have too much power in finance, Jews have too much power in the media.
Yeah.
Like not large numbers, but not minorities so small you can just ignore them either.
Yeah.
So we did a huge amount of work on that, months in the making, reporting trips to different countries, very data-driven, and we won an Edward R. Murrow Award for that, which I'm very proud of.
This is probably going to sound like a stupid question, but I think one of the reasons this is hard to talk about is it's sometimes really unclear what anti-Semitism is in that sense. And we have some confusion, particularly because there is this group of people who are Jews, and then there is a nation state with a very strong identification with that group of people.
Right.
Where the lines are, did you come up with a definition of what anti-Semitism is?
We didn't set out to define it. There are various more or less accepted international definitions of it. We did, on the very smart advice of my predecessor as Jerusalem Bureau Chief, test attitudes about Israel specifically.
Right. So you could disambiguate
how do you feel about Israel, the United States, Russia, China, North Korea, to try to distinguish between anti-Israel sentiment, which can be separated from anti-Semitism. It's not always, but it can be.
Yeah.
I have friends who think that every, smart, responsible, honest, intelligent people who think that every pro-Palestinian demonstration these days is an expression of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And I say to them, I can imagine a person of goodwill looking at news footage of what's happening in Gaza right now, possibly with insufficient context, but with or without context, and coming away from that thinking, I am pro-Palestinian. I don't want Palestinian people to be suffering what they're suffering and not be anti-Semites. Do I think that that is the response that Hamas wanted and that they knew exactly what they were doing and that they knew that the Netanyahu government would respond with the incredible fury that it has responded with? Yes, they knew. I remember on the afternoon of October 7th thinking, what did Hamas think they were doing? Because I knew what the response would be. And within a couple of weeks, I was like, they knew exactly what they were doing. This is what they wanted. They wanted to make the world see Israel as a terribly destructive force, bombing the hell out of innocent Palestinian women and children. I think Hamas was prepared to sacrifice those innocent women and children. I think that the Israeli government responded exactly. I think they, did they fall into a Hamas trap? Did they take the excuse they wanted to try and take over territory? I don't know what's in their hearts, but I think both sides knew exactly what they were doing.
Let's come back to this thing you said really early on. This thing and yes, this thing. Did I misquote you? Two things can be true.
Yes.
Because I sit with it a lot, this sort of glitch/function of the way we talk about things in public. The difference between how most human beings are able to hold two things in their head, the devastation and the destruction and the suffering of October 7th and since on innocent Israeli and Israeli immigrant and curly-haired 19-year-olds, right?
Yeah.
And the women and children in the refugee camps that fled for safety and then blown to pieces. And in public, it always feels like there is no space where you do not have to pick a side. That there's almost something about acknowledging multiple true things that is really hard to get any energy from, right? To move forward into. It doesn't make a great piece or a great segment or a great tweet. Like, it is both, I think, a more humane and realistic assessment of many issues, that multiple things can be true. And somehow the public debate is not designed to hold it. There's nowhere to put it. And so this mutual polarization, this mutual radicalization that's happening then feeds back into it feeling more and more difficult to hold two true things and being like, maybe I'm an idiot. Maybe I'm like a terrible fence sitter. And one of these groups are the bad guys and one of these groups are the good guys. And what is your working theory for why that's so hard? And what have you found that is good medicine for it?
Huge sigh. Huge, long sigh. So let me go back to something that I said earlier. I am very grateful that I went to Jerusalem as a journalist and not as a Jew. Because it meant that I met a wide variety of people there. And I think knowing a wide variety of people, like I have a friend who is a West Bank settler rabbi, came to Israel as a teenager from Chicago, actually practically the same postcode as me, who lives in a relatively extreme settlement. So Jewish nationalist. Yeah. And he teaches at a school for Jewish nationalist, religious Zionist settler youth who are going into the Israeli military.
Right.
I have a friend who was a high-ranking Israel Defense Forces officer on October 7th who did his duty in an exemplary fashion for months in a very public-facing way. And when his tour ended, was back out on the streets of Tel Aviv protesting against the government. I have a friend who is an aid worker in Gaza, Palestinian. She's from Gaza. She's still there. Given who she works for, I'm guessing she could have gotten herself evacuated and has not. And I check in with her every couple of weeks to see how she's doing. And I ask, what can I do to help? And she says, can you find me an online creative writing course that I can do?
Oh.
It's unbelievable, right? The whole range. And I think like seeing, and now, okay, preachy as if it's so easy, like have a bunch of different friends, you have a bunch of different views. But, all the individual people are more complicated than you think they are. I've been asked to talk about Jewish pluralism. Jewish pluralism for me is not Orthodox people say this and Reform people say this, religious Zionists say this, and Tel Aviv high-tech intelligentsia say that. Each one of us individually is like pluralistically complicated.
Yeah.
So that's one part of that answer is all the individuals are themselves. And my West Bank rabbi settler friend, I even as I knew, the day that the Israelis killed Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, I happened to be in the old city of Jerusalem with my West Bank rabbi settler friend, a religious Zionist, a right-winger, homophobic, believing that Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, promised by God to Jews. And these settler kids, like 20-year-olds, appear in the streets of the old city and they're playing this Jewish nationalist song and they're handing out candy. And my friend won't take it, and so I don't take it. And
why won't you take it?
They have a conversation, and I say to him after this, it goes by very quickly in Hebrew. And I say to him, what was that all about? And he said, they're celebrating the killing of Ismail Haniyeh. And I said to them, how do you feel when they pass out candy when Jews are killed? And they said to me, but we're happy. And I said to them, you can be happy that the operation was a success without celebrating the death of a person. This is not a Tel Aviv lefty. This is not an anti-Netanyahu. He's like, I say this with respect for him. He is trying to seize land that the Palestinians want to be theirs because he believes that God promised it to him.
Yeah.
But he's also lecturing other settlers to say, you can't be celebrating the death of a person. It's wrong. Even the leader of Hamas, even after October 7th, to celebrate the death of a person is wrong. There's a lot of nuance there.
Richard Allen Greene, thank you so much for speaking to me on The Sacred.
Thank you.
Oh, wow. I'm so grateful to Richard for being willing to reflect with me on one of our most painful current questions, events, news stories, divides that is very live right now and has been live for so long, too long. And I'm left with the line that he said about the line being not between the good guys and the bad guys, Israelis or Palestinians, but between people who want to fight for the full humanity of every human person and those that do not. And you find that divide cutting through all kinds of other tribal lines. Holy, not sacred. I love it when people push back. I love it when people expand my understandings and help me see the gaps in my thinking and my the partialness of my lenses and my views. I've been doing this since 2017 and I still feel so like I have so much to learn about how other people think and how different from how I think they often are, and how helpful that is to know, right? That
sacred is Christian coded for Richard, and that within Judaism, this sense of holiness or separateness has a slightly different resonance, right? And yeah, for him, it is that sense of the human, the dignity and value of the human, the Shekinah that lives in us, the bit of the divine that lives in us is, I think, what I was hearing from him. And I was interested in that conversation about kind of minority communities and cultures and how we live in that messy middle space between adapting and changing, because we and the world are always changing, and that a kind of rigid commitment to everything remaining as it has always been becomes ossified and constricting. And that if we are almost too blown with the winds of change, right? If we let go of everything that we've inherited, or we adapt too much to the culture around us, in the case of his Jewish community, as he was talking about, we can lose our particularity. We can lose our sense of ourselves. We can lose the things that we were committed to. I talk about it in a Substack piece as we need deep roots and wide branches. We need to be really confident in our sense of selves and what we believe and who we are, and not let that be a barrier to deep connection with the other. I think we, again, keep coming back to this false binary between you can have kind of particular thick cultures and firm commitments, or you can have hospitality and openness to the other, but you can't have both. I don't think that's true. I think there is a wise, steady, intentional space where you can have both, but that often communities and cultures are kind of swinging back and forth between knowing where the balance is. The thing he said about how they process journalistically what to say in public, and this search for balance or objectivity or neutrality, all of these words, none of which are that helpful in and of themselves, but I can't immediately think of a better alternative, really clarified something for me about, and again, it comes back to why this listening to the other is so important, that we need that. Journalism is a communal exercise, is what I was hearing from him. Good journalism is a communal exercise, right? You need editors, you need peers, you need someone to say, this is what the story looks like from my perspective, and then someone to check it and go, nope, you are importing your set of references, you are importing your biases. Have you thought about it this way? Have you spoken to that person? Then you need an editor. And that really good journalism is really good journalists are prepared to kind of subvert their ego in that way, surrender their ego, and allow the teamwork to bring them to a better, more accurate reporting on the world. And this rang true with so much of what I believe about truth in general, meaning in general. So John Vervaeke said at an Unheard event I did with him recently, which you can find the recording of on YouTube, meaning is a collective concept, that we cannot create our own meaning. It is between us. And I feel the same way about truth. I feel the same way about when you're studying a sacred text, that actually it is in conversation with others that can be uncomfortable and challenging and knotty, that you come closer to a sense of what the text might be really trying to tell you. Jonathan Rauch, who we'll interview later in this year, talks about it with democracy, that actually it is in the uncomfortable contestation of public debates where we are forced to listen to each other and compromise with each other, that is how we remain what he calls a reality-based community, that we are incapable as individuals and even as small tribes or families of accurately seeing the world. Like, we have, I want to use the phrase blind spots, and now I'm questioning how helpful that is as a phrase, but I'm going to go with it and leave an asterisk on it. We have parts of the world, parts of life we cannot see. We have never been shown. There are experiences that we cannot understand, and we need someone to tell us about them. And that this sense of collective meaning-making, collective truth-seeking, collective understanding makes sense for my anthropology, my understanding of what human being is, that we are interdependent, interrelated persons, not really individuals at all. In a world we're continually being told to go do your own research, right? Don't be affected by other people. Don't be a sheep. Don't be, this is why I get so hard on Descartes, because he thought the way to truth was to like reject everything he'd ever been told, everything he'd ever inherited from tradition, everything he'd ever learned, and go sit alone in his room for days and like strip everything back to his own consciousness. And that was the way to truth. I differ. Let's say that. And it also really underlined for me something that's come up a little bit in this season. And when we talk about different temperaments and different political intuitions, I'm realizing that I had a really interesting conversation with James Orr, and as with many guests, there's lots that I agree with and things that I disagree with. But he said something about diversity and equity and inclusion at the end, which was, you can go listen to it if you like. But something he said stuck in my brain and I couldn't quite figure out why it was bothering me. And it was something like, diversity is always a challenge, or diversity is always a problem. That actually we just need to manage it, that it will always be difficult for us. It will always be something. I don't think he said diversity is always a threat. He wouldn't go that far, but this sense that why would we welcome diversity it just needs to be managed. That's the best we can do. And I realized talking to Richard that I just come out somewhere really different on that. And I think it's grounded in my doctrine of creation, actually, and I probably learned it best from another Jewish thinker, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who talks about the dignity of difference. That difference is really challenging and really stretches us and is uncomfortable because we have homophily, because we have people like me syndrome, because actually we're sort of default quite fragile and narcissistic, and we really like to see ourselves reflected back at us, and that is generally how we feel most relaxed. But there is an encountering other ways of seeing the world, other ways of understanding deep things, that we get closer to truth, and we get closer to reality, and we get closer to each other. And because I believe that we are made for each other and we are made by each other, it's how we stay fully human. And Richard's unpacking of what happens in a newsroom, for some reason, really unlocked that for me. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Sacred. My name is Elizabeth Oldfield, and our production team are Dan Turner, Amari Gandran, and Lizzie Harvey. We're edited by Drew Hawley, and our music is by Luke Stanley. The Sacred is a project of the think tank Theos, and if you have not heard of Theos, I would love you to go check out our wider work. We have a sister podcast called Reading Our Times, hosted by my friend Nick Spencer, and we also have an amazing 4-part documentary podcast called Motherhood versus the Machine, hosted by Chinny McDonald, who did a bonus episode with us earlier this year that I wholeheartedly recommend, and I really hope you will go and listen to. Until next time, I will speak to you then.